I have the honor of moderating this panel, and we've got a lot of great talent up here on the stage, so I think it might make sense just to walk through some brief introductions before we get started. So to my far right is Dena Acevedo, and Dena's a senior corporate counsel at Juniper Networks, and in that role she negotiates M&A and other strategic transactions and advises on Juniper's investment activities. And prior to joining Juniper, Dena, you were in the M&A group of Simpson Thacher. All right, and Rachel Masory is to Dena's left, and Rachel's a deputy general counsel of Golden Gate Capital, which is a private equity fund with over $15 billion in committed capital. Rachel negotiates M&A transactions, acts as outside general counsel to portfolio companies, and represent Golden Gate Capital's management company in her current role. Prior to joining Golden Gate in 2014, Rachel was a private equity partner at Kirkland & Ellis's Chicago office. And so, welcome. And this is Nate McKitterick, and Nate is a partner at DLA Piper, where he advises on M&A insurance and indemnification issues, and he has done so for nearly 20 years across over 1,000 deals. So DLA Piper itself, as many of you may know, did over 300 M&A deals in 2017 and was ranked #1 globally. And that brings us to me. My name is Larry Shapiro. I'm a senior vice president in the mergers and acquisitions group of Willis Towers Watson. I guess I don't have to read this part. I should probably know this a little bit. Woo! So let's get rid of this. And yeah, I did make the trip over from New York, but in fact, I am in process of moving out to San Francisco. So within a couple of weeks, I'll be the newly minted Willis resident here. So excited about that.
And it's an upgrade, right, Larry?
From New York?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh. Well, is anyone here from New York before I? So just earmuffs, and then we can get on. Yeah, no, it certainly is an exciting, I think, opportunity for myself and for our firm. My group specializes in transactional insurance solutions, focusing primarily on reps and warranties insurance, tax insurance, and other contingent liabilities. And before that, I was in the corporate group at Cozen O'Connor. So having introduced everybody up here, maybe it just makes a little bit of sense outside of geographies, New York in particular, to figure out, as far as the room goes, just to get a sense of the composition of the room. Do we have folks here that represent financial sponsors and private equity? How many folks here are sort of from that realm? Or maybe from the strategic acquirers, sort of? Super, so a fair amount. And then advisors, just to get a sense. So sort of 3 general categories. I almost want to ask for the other. I don't know if that's going to launch us into more of those details that you were talking about before, so maybe best to avoid that. But so no, I think everybody's got a good sense of who each other are on either side of the days. So as you mentioned, we're here to talk about negotiating M&A deal terms, and thought that it might make sense to start really right at the top and discuss some of the key components to negotiating a transaction, factors to consider in negotiation strategies. I think all generally within the context of the hypothetical scenario that we've got with the East Corporation's acquisition of West Corporation. But it may direct our first question to Dena and to Rachel to try to focus on what you consider to be some of the more critical components of a transaction and some factors that would help you determine how to address those within the context of a transaction and negotiating the terms. And maybe the most obvious starting point is on valuation. So maybe, given the hypothetical that we've been asked to consider, maybe walk us through how you might consider, a valuation strategy.
Well, I think when you're looking at a tech company that you're acquiring, I think the first question I would ask is, am I really focused just on the patents and the trademarks and the actual assets that are registered, or am I really focused on the people? And do I really, am I highly dependent on their sales team or their founders or certain innovators? And depending on the answer to that question, you would structure the transaction differently. So If it was a former, I'd be really pretty much okay just saying, okay, here's your purchase price, give me your IP, and walking away. If it's the latter and I really need those people, I would really need to structure the transaction to make sure that they stick around and that they're motivated to do their best for us in the same way as they were when they worked for themselves or worked in their old structure.
I think from a strategic point of view, I agree with everything that was just said, but I'd also add that a lot of the consideration is around the synergies and, what is the point of the acquisition? Is this a tuck-in acquisition that we're trying to then, merge with something we already have? Is it going to be a standalone business unit? What are we going to do with the acquisition? And how does the acquisition, say it's a technology play, right? What kind of synergy do we have with what we already own? Because that can also impact, maybe not the valuation per se, but what you're willing to pay, the multiple you're willing to pay in order to acquire the technology or the people.
Thank you. And I think we had talked, and you mentioned it just a moment ago, and I know, Nate, that we had talked earlier about retention and different ways to maybe structure the transaction or structure either bonus structure or whether it's the use of an escrow or an earnout, rather. How have you seen your clients addressing retention?
Different ways. It depends on who you're trying to keep happy, right? There's always, if it's the right structure, you can always use a rollover of equity. Those are always popular, particularly with founders or other important people. I'm seeing more bonus structures for people who aren't the top guys, but they want to keep around. It's built into a deal. What other things are you guys seeing being used out there to keep the people that you want to keep happy?
So as a financial buyer, we almost always want to keep management and most of, if not all, the employees around. So we typically try to set up our incentive structure with equity to give them capital gains treatment for their investment, and also hope that it will keep them around for longer. Our equity would be subject to vesting, which will help with retention, and it will also align them with maximizing equity value for us since they're kind of along for the ride. So that's typically how we do it. I would think that as a strategic, you're probably thinking about it differently.
Yeah, so I think there were quite a few strategics here. So as a strategic, we come at it a little bit differently because, depending on the size of the acquisition and what's happening, people are going to be rolled into what we already have, and they're going to be kind of, we're a big company, and they're going to be leveled in advance of, coming in and put into, they're going from a CEO maybe to a director level, or a CEO to a vice president level. And so, you have a whole organization and a structure where people who are already employees of this company are making a certain amount of money within a band, and they're getting a certain amount of equity within a band. And so you can't then bring people in and say, by the way, here's your gigantic amount of equity or gigantic amount of cash that would then upset kind of the ecosystem you already have going in your company, because of course everybody will know. So we have to be quite creative in terms of ways to structure things so that people are retained, and we also have to be honest with ourselves in terms of what we can do in order to actually retain people going forward. We spend a good amount of time looking at, how much is, CEO A going to make in connection with this transaction, and what's the likelihood that we can actually retain them, right? If they're getting a $100 million payout, we're probably not going to be able to do all that much to actually financially get them to stay. The incentives may need to be more along the lines of, title and responsibility and, other kind of more intangibles, right? So it's a very different calculation, and one that takes an awful lot of our brain power in connection with any sort of acquisition.
For sure. So then I guess the curiosity is, when you're looking at these various considerations and then obviously gearing up towards the negotiations, how does the nature of the party, I think we talked about here, we've got a strategic acquirer in East Corp, but I'm not certain that we've really sussed out what the ownership structure is of West Corp. I think we know some basics around the target's profile, but not really the ownership. So curious, and I'm sure different people in the room may have different experience in this, but curious how the ownership of that target might affect your negotiations.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll start. So if it's founder owned and actually the founder's still involved, I think there can be a lot more emotion involved in the acquisition, as opposed to if it's something where the founder's kind of taken a back seat, they've brought a CDO in specifically to sell the company, or the founder's kind of already transitioned out. It also depends on how broadly distributed the equity is. How much of it is options versus how much of it is actually stock. A lot of it, at least for us, and maybe other strategics do it differently, in terms of, when you're talking about structuring indemnities, the actual mechanics of any sort of, payouts of escrow and those kinds of things. We have a strong preference for paying out to, we'll put stockholders in an escrow, but we don't want to put the option holders in an escrow because paying through payroll is a gigantic pain. Especially when you're talking 3 years down the road, and then you've got to go find, the hundreds of different people. I mean, it's my worst nightmare. So, all of that really impacts how we then think about structuring what we're doing in terms of specifically an indemnity package in connection with the transaction.
If the founder is still involved, it really is a question of, are they going to walk away or are they staying? For the people we want to keep around, and it's important to us to keep around, if they're owners, we'll want them to roll over maybe half of their stock. I mean, we're happy for them to cash out some amount. We're always focused on, are we giving them so much cash that they have just no incentive to work anymore? People have different thresholds for that, but I would estimate that, if somebody's getting $10 million or more, they really don't feel they need to work for $250K a year anymore. So we really try for those critical people to both motivate them and force them to continue. The really critical people know that they are critical to the business, and so if you make them roll over a significant portion of their equity, or you give them enough incentive equity to really motivate them, that will usually keep them around. There's also founders who really are emotional about their businesses. I know the California way is sort of to be a serial entrepreneur, but a lot of times if you've worked on a business and made it big enough for a large strategic or a financial buyer to buy you, you've been working on it for a long time. It's not a 2-year project. It's your baby. You've worked on it for 10 plus years. And so a lot of these founders want to stay with us, and they don't want to let go control the business. So actually, they'll be very focused on negotiating an employment agreement or something like that lets them continue.
And that gets the problem of what happens when you do have a founder that has a big equity stake, and we as a strategic buyer are saying, well, we're going to want you to park X% of these proceeds in an escrow. I mean, that founder is going to look at that as her money or his money. And maybe the purchase price is high enough that everyone's okay with it, but the fact is that if you're going to make a claim against that escrow, you're taking it away from your current division lead or the former CEO or whatever role that person is playing in your go-forward organization. And that can be tricky. So tricky, I even had a client who had a straight dead bang reps claim against the founder of a company that it acquired, and it decided not to make the claim because it didn't want to upset him. That goose was still laying golden eggs.
That's really a good point. If we know that we have people continuing with us, we're not going to want a normal indemnity package, because the last thing you want is to go to one of your employees and say, hey, write me a check. So we will always, if the people are continuing with the company, we're always going to be looking at an earn-out structure or an escrow or some other way, like reps and warranties insurance, to get the downside protection, because we don't want to harm our upside by covering, whatever downside there is. And we have had situations where, a state tax claim or something will come up that the sellers are responsible for, but we always want it to be a situation where we are not asking them to write us a check. There is some other source of funds for it.
And we talked about founders, and we talked, some of the dynamics and some of the challenges. Now, if there's venture capital involved, it gets to the point where you're seeking to acquire the target. How does that affect your negotiations? How does that affect some of the considerations we've been talking about?
Well, as a financial buyer, we're also a financial seller, and so,
Yeah.
I find that they're going to have the same priority I would when we sell a portfolio company, which is, look, we'll negotiate whatever indemnity package we negotiate, but there is a cap, and that's it. So there will be an escrow, there will be whatever it is, but the second I get that cash, I distribute it to my LPs. And I do not ever want to be in a world where I have to go to my investors and claw back funds. Obviously, under my fund agreement, I'm allowed to do that. If we owe an indemnity claim, we can ask our LPs to fund that, but I never want to be in that situation. So I will always insist on just an absolute cap for everything, even fundamental reps.
Yeah.
How about purchase price adjustments?
Purchase price adjustments.
That's the new thing
handle.
now, caps on PPAs that we're starting to see. Can you believe it?
And I have that in a lot of my deals. Like it will be capped at, we'll have a purchase price adjustment escrow for 6 months or whatever, and it's capped there.
Yeah, we're working through that now. And in our world, on the insurance side of the house, that also becomes more problematic, just given the way the insurance has been set up. So,
I will say from my perspective, and me personally, I love when I see VCs in a deal on the other side, because it's very clear, right? It's dollars and cents, and there it is. And we can negotiate around it, and it's dollars and cents. You avoid kind of all of the founder potential issues, which I think can be much more difficult to navigate because it's not just right there for you to deal with, right? I think it can be it can be very beneficial. We may not be on the same side of issues, but the issue is clear.
And they have a cleaner shop usually if a financial buyer's already been in the house.
And I think that would have been my next follow-up question, is also then when you're looking at diligencing the target, is it then a different experience? And granted, everything likely changes based on the personalities. I mean, one founder is different from the next, founder is different from the next, but I wonder if you were to compare sort of founder-owned targets to a financial sponsor that owned it, if it's cleaner, does that make the diligence process easier?
I do think so, because someone else has already diligenced the company. But I also find in a company that's still founder-owned, you're very dependent on sort of just the innate level of talent that management has and the people that they hired have, because they've never really been professionalized, and have not necessarily worked in these huge companies where they know best practices for everything. So they're really all over the map once you buy it on what you have to do to make things operate the way that they should. And I think the most common thing you replace when you go into a company that is still founder run is usually the CFO, because their entire finance function doesn't really operate properly, or maybe with the accuracy or level of analysis that you want. And I would say that also makes your diligence really challenging, because you are reliant always for diligence on what they give you, and you kind of have to assume they're being honest, and they're usually being honest, but you also have to assume some level of accuracy, which may or may not be true, especially when you're looking at finances and things like that.
Sure.
But where someone like Sergio will come to us with a deal that they've found it isn't a banker represented seller, it's not someone who's on the market, it's just somebody they know about, they want to get. Yeah, that company might not have the greatest, might be a year off QuickBooks or whatever, but it may be an incredible opportunity. So you work through those things as best you can. I mean, that's, the diligence may not be as good, but you're going to have maybe an opportunity there you wouldn't get for a company that was run by a financial buyer.
And I think then we can apply that to the fact pattern here, where you've got a tech company growing at a pretty rapid clip. And then you've got some of those hurdles to clear, including, financial statements, which we've talked about, now a bit. And, in the absence of, say, audited financials, I mean, if they're a year off QuickBooks, right? Just finding a way to get yourself comfortable on the basis of your financial diligence that, that the results are adequate and that they've been keeping things in order.
Well, and even if they're audited, that doesn't mean they're accurate.
Fair enough.
Especially when you change auditors. Isn't that interesting how suddenly that causes issues?
Well, I mean, I guess you asked the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that definitely is. And then, so moving on to actually negotiating the terms of the deal. Now you've taken a look at some things that you're going to focus on, obviously, in the course of determining your interest and determining valuation, and then understanding how best to diligence this target. Then, I guess, turning to how you negotiate. I mean, I don't know if focusing on particular reps is a good jumping off point here.
I think for me, a lot of it depends on kind of the transaction. And what I mean by that is this a situation where there was a deal process in place where, you know, they're selling themselves, the bankers were engaged, they're shopping this, it's a competitive process. And so like you're providing a markup of an agreement, which is going to be compared against a whole bunch of other people along with your price? Or is it a situation where, you know, our, you know, corp dev group was out hunting basically and, you know, said we want these guys and, you know, they engaged them in an exclusivity period and then we're approaching them with like, this is what we're prepared to do. Depending on that posture, you know, what posture we're in, it'll look really different in terms of the terms, right? And where we start as far as how competitive, and market-based and whatever else you want to say we are in terms of the various terms we offer up.
It's also dependent on how sophisticated the seller is. You know, if they're represented by Simpson Thacher, I know that they're going to catch every nuance in what I write. But if maybe they don't, you know, they have their single shingle law firm that does everything representing them because they're old friends, you know, I can get away with a little bit more. So I definitely try to play to my audience. But ultimately, I think a seller is really focused usually on purchase price, and that's about it. So as long as you're not doing things in the agreement to shift a lot of liability to them or to somehow subtract from that purchase price significantly, in an auction, they're going to pick the highest price. Almost always. I've been in auctions where we gave the best agreement on earth and the best indemnity terms on earth or whatever, but if you don't have the highest price, you lose. And the only secondary factor, again, is this situation where you have perhaps some equity holders or CEOs or whatever who are really vested in keeping their jobs and staying around or controlling the company, and there you have some room to play.
Well, I'm tempted to ask the question about where you spend more time negotiating on various points, although obviously that's going to wildly vary. Thinking about something maybe a little bit more near and dear to a lot of people's hearts in this room, in an auction context, what's everybody seeing in terms of formal exclusivity period these days, and you know, sellers' appetite for running multiple parties to sign, time periods that they're allowing to complete diligence once they've actually made a decision. Curious.
How many hours, basically?
How many? I mean, it only goes around. Yeah, exactly right.
Well, it's certainly a seller's market right now, that's for sure. In the really competitive auctions for a strong company, you may not get exclusivity at all. Yeah. It could be that you negotiate the merger agreement over the weekend while they negotiate with 2-3 other people. They pick their best person and they sign Monday morning. But that's still unusual. Typically, they will pick like their lead bidder and give you some amount of exclusivity. I don't see those 60, 90-day periods anymore. I'm seeing a lot more like 14 to 30 days, but perhaps I'm cynical, but I generally enter these exclusivity arrangements assuming that we're going to extend them multiple times.
It does happen, right?
Yeah.
We get these short periods and we just end up extending them.
Yeah, it just doesn't really matter because once they have told their other bidders to go away for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and they've spent 2, 3, 4 weeks negotiating with you, usually they're kind of pregnant on the deal, and they'll just keep going, and they'll extend until you get it done.
Yeah, I agree. 30 days, extended.
Yeah.
And is that really to keep a particular bidder's feet to the fire?
I mean, I think it's just what people are willing to agree to up front is, 30 days. It looks worse when you come in and you're like, I'd like 180 days of exclusivity, right? Not that we ever go 180 days, but Yeah.
And the biggest conflict for many of my clients were these compressed exclusivity periods. And if they had deals that involved reps insurance as a critical part of the deal, trying to get the reps insurance locked down when you didn't have exclusivity. And just even a couple of years ago, you had to pay the insurance carrier hundreds of thousands of dollars to give you a bindable quote before you had at least de facto exclusivity. Mm-hmm. And now there's more insurers who are willing to do that for a lot less money. So if I have a buyer and the insurance is a really important part of the deal, and they don't have exclusivity, they can still get that bindable quote to rely on when they sign with the seller. even if they don't have the diligence completed yet?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been interesting because I think when you've seen a seller actually wire reps and warranties insurance into an acquisition agreement, it at least suggested or it implied that there was going to be a little bit of extra time there, at least 3 to 5 business days in order to get the insurance process done. But you're right. I think with the growing awareness of the availability of pre-exclusivity, as needed, it's probably not the perfect process. It's moving quite quickly, and obviously as the rest of the deal teams are. But it no longer really implies that there is this unspoken anticipated period of exclusivity. We just did a market exercise yesterday on pre-exclusivity fees, and you're right. It runs a gamut from nothing to $30,000 extra to $100,000 extra. So there still is a wide variety, but I think that there is definitely ability to get that done. So maybe using that as a transition and talking about some of the challenges that you've faced in negotiating some of these transactions and worrying about retention and worrying about maybe proceeding against a founder or a shareholder for something maybe beyond the purchase price adjustment, Nate. What has your experience been in using an alternative recourse mechanism like reps and warranties insurance, and how have you seen it affect deals? How have you seen it be responsive to some of these challenges that we've talked about in the context of drafting terms?
Well, we're primarily still using to try to bridge a gap, right? You have two parties. I'll give you an example from out here. You have a seller that is being asked to provide 100% indemnity on IP because, like a lot of deals in the Valley, IP is why we're one of the main reasons we might be buying a company. Mm-hmm. And that seller doesn't want to give you 100% indemnity. Yep. So how do you bridge that gap? And one deal we bridged the gap on with my partner, Louis Lahaut, a couple of years ago was the seller actually paid for the buyer to buy insurance against the IP reps. And the buyer didn't buy 100% at the end of the day, but they compromised at 45%. So that gave the buyer some recourse without having to go chase down the sellers, which was nice for the buyer. The seller paid for it, but the seller also got to walk away with certainty that at least a huge chunk of the deal consideration was in their pocket. Yeah. So it still primarily is a gap bridger. And again, you might have founders that you want to keep happy. You don't want to make claims against them. There can be a number of reasons. Maybe the fund that you're buying from is closing, so an indemnity from them isn't worth anything, or they know they can't give you an indemnity, so you've got to look at insurance or other things. Maybe it's a particular problem, like I think in this example, West Corporation has a tax issue. I mean, tax insurance, we'll do that all day long. As long as it's something that is material to the deal, but still a remote issue or something we can at least put a risk number around, right? Like, that's probably a $2 million problem. Well, fine, I can buy insurance if it's a $2.5 million problem or more. That's the kind of thing that we're using it for every day. Yeah. And more and more strategics. That's the biggest change in the market that I've seen the last 3 years, is this has now become not just a strategic buy-side thing to get, but also now I see strategics using it on spins. They'll go out there with a deal and say, oh, okay, well, here's the deal we're going to give the market. We're going to give you a 0.5% naked indemnity, and if you want to go and get insurance, go ahead, but this is what we're going to give you on this spin. That's always fun, seeing the strategics kind of give at the market what they've had to eat going into some competitive deals.
I do think it's become more and more prevalent. Earlier in my career, you didn't really see people using reps and warranties insurance, or only 2 or 3 insurance companies that even offered it. And now you see it all over the place. There's a lot of insurance companies providing it, and we use it in many, many of our deals. And in fact, sellers that are running a full process and have a competitive auction can require you to use it and pay for it. So you're definitely seeing it a lot more. And I think because of the increased prevalence of it, I do find that my deal teams sometimes are asking me questions that are kind of funny, that they'll be like, well, I have this known issue. and it's not a remote possibility and it's a known issue, can I get insurance for that? And so I would say the answer to that is still no.
Yeah,
unless you want
sales
the
taxes,
premium
yes.
to be equal to the amount of the issue. So you're still looking at unknown or kind of maybe a known remote possibility, but it can still, it really can cover a huge amount of issues. I think especially when you're looking at maybe a startup or a tech company target, they may be really clean and run a very tight shop on things like, their patent filings, but everything else may be a little bit more mysterious to that founder. And so that's a great place to really use that product.
I think when you're looking at alternative solutions like reps and warranties insurance or tax insurance to shift risk from the deal parties to the insurance market, you can look at it across more of a spectrum. And on one end you've got the truly unknown risks, and on the other end you start to gravitate more towards known exposures. And just as a quick crash course, reps and warranties insurance functions the best for unknown exposures, and they'll run through the diligence to determine what is known on the underwriting process, and then the expectation is to pick up any of the exposure that comes through the reps and breaches of the reps. Anything that's unknown would typically find a home with reps and warranties insurance. And then you start to gravitate more down the spectrum if it's a tax exposure, something that's been identified as an exposure but isn't necessarily a known problem. And then you start looking at tax insurance, and like you said, there is definitely a really deep skill set in the market as far as how to really understand the risk profile of that particular issue and maybe underwrite to it. So
the rule of thumb is if it's something you would normally expect a special indemnity or special escrow on, you probably can't, you can't get rep and warranty insurance probably against that. There are some other insurance products that we've used. Like for example, we had a seller that we represented that was being sued by one of its competitors, and it was anti-competitive litigation, completely BS. And we were able to go out and get AIG to give us a very large policy against a bad outcome of that litigation, because AIG underwrote it and concluded the litigation was BS. It was just anti-competitive. They weren't going. This competitor wasn't going to win, and we went to market with that policy, saying, "Hey, we know these guys have sued us, but we've got protection against that for all buyers." And that competitor ended up making a very nice offer to our client who sold to the competitor because the bullet had been taken out of the gun. So we still don't see a lot of those policies being purchased, but we do see it.
I think it's a growth area. I mean, we've now got a lot of competition in the insurance market. There's over 20 underwriters, and it's putting a lot of pressure on individual underwriters to either get more aggressive on some of the more commonplace areas like reps and warranties insurance and or tax. But in the contingent liability end of that spectrum, they are probably more rare and they're much more bespoke. But that is one of the developing areas, I'd say, as is the mix of who's buying these types of insurance products.
Well, Rachel, how many deals in your last year, what percentage do you think used focused on insurance in some way as being an important part of the deal?
We've considered it in every transaction. We've probably used it in about half. Like I said, there are some auctions where they really require you to. It's written into the agreement itself, and you could still forfeit that right. But generally, we'll really look at the company and we'll think like, how clean is this company? How impressed are we with management and our diligence and whatnot? And sort of a cost-benefit analysis on the cost of the insurance versus do we really think that we'll have indemnification claims? Because remember, your indemnity claim is probably going to be subject to a basket and a cap before you even get there. So if you look at it, a $300 million deal, and you have to have $1 million of claims before you can even start to make claims on the policy, it may not be worth it.
So Dena gets both escrows and insurance because she has that much leverage, but
we do, and I was actually going to mention that. So the one thing, right? The one, I guess, kind of the opposite side of getting an insurance policy is, there were a lot of things where you come across them and they're not connected with reps and warranties, and they're things that you would otherwise maybe want to get a special escrow for, but you don't want to go through the headache of negotiating it. And when you were just doing kind of an escrow generally and you don't have insurance, okay, so we're going to get a $10 million escrow. Okay, so $350,000 here, and $1 million there, and whatever, like things that you find, you're like, okay, I'm quantifying it. This is what it is. Our escrow can handle it. Okay, we're not going to worry about trying to get a specific escrow for it. When you go ahead and get insurance, You typically, well, when we get insurance, we'll end up with an escrow also, but it's a much smaller escrow, right? So, a $200 million deal, you'll end up with, a $2 million escrow, and then also your reps and warranties insurance. And so those other odds and ends that don't fall within the reps and warranties things, so tax or whatever else, they start to add up really quickly. And really quickly you find that you no longer have any sort of recourse as you're doing your calculations. And that's not even looking at what actually exists after you do the acquisition. So you have to be really careful in terms of, sometimes it actually opens the door to needing to have the special indemnity, the special escrow conversation that you otherwise wouldn't have to have. That said, on the flip side of it, I love getting reps and warranties insurance. We've done it in the last few deals that we've done. Because I think an inordinate amount of time is spent negotiating reps and warranties, right? Just a ridiculous amount of time, and people get very, very heated, I think, over things that obviously are super important, but they're not so much more important than everything else. But I think there's a lot of emphasis placed on it, and it really smooths the conversation, right? And you can also use the insurance companies as kind of, the insurance, you want to marry your reps and warranties up with whatever your insurance will do. Well, the insurance won't do that, so we got to change it. Okay, we're good. All right, fine, right? So it really makes it a lot easier. And I'll give you a hypothetical. Hypothetically speaking, your company A goes out and buys, some company, and the CEO, you don't have reps and warranties insurance, and the CEO gets really upset and feels beaten up over the way in which the reps and warranties conversation were handled. It was a clean negotiation, but whatever. He didn't like where it ended up. Then he comes in at a position that's fairly senior to company A's. In company A, and then you have the opportunity to go and clear the air with them because they're in a position where you get to continue working with them down the road, and so you want to actually have a positive working relationship as opposed to kind of the angry, hostile, reps and warranties negotiation that occurred. So to the extent insurance can kind of make all of that disappear, that's always a plus in my book.
And that is the root, I think, of the insurance, was as a deal facilitation tool. Yeah. And we're going to take Q&A in just a minute. Just probably won't run through one or two more questions, but just to let anybody know.
A deal close tool too, and that hypothetical example where between signing and closing, you discover a breach at your target. And that's actually happened to us in a deal. And if you have rep and warranty insurance that you bound at signing, and it turns out the breach that occurred was something that wasn't true, like, we've updated all our servers, and it turns out that wasn't the case, then as long as that isn't a MAC breach, like in the example, if it's not a MAC breach, it doesn't kill the deal, and my buyer still has to close, we can close and then make a claim for damages from that breach against the insurance. So that's an advantage. For sure.
So I think my last question for the panel was just with respect to caps and with respect to reduced escrows. I mean, if you're in a position where you're either getting escrow and or reps and warranties insurance or otherwise, well, maybe when you're getting insurance, are you seeing fundamental exposure, seller's exposure for fundamental reps? Are you seeing that capped at all, or is that still customarily going up to purchase price?
I'm definitely seeing it capped. I push back on it really hard. I don't like it. I'd rather cut the survival period on a fundamental rep from being indefinite to, say, being 3 years or 2 years. Yeah. But I am definitely seeing that. I would typically expect it to be a higher cap than the rest of the indemnification. And traditionally maybe it's capped at purchase price and no more, but now I'm definitely seeing something like 10, 20%. People are really not offering it. I take small comfort in the fact that if you've reached your fundamentals, you've probably committed fraud, and that is an exception to all of the indemnity package in any case. Yeah.
We're seeing a cap. We're pretty successful in pushing back against it. It depends. I mean, it really depends on if we're willing to walk away or not over this issue. But yeah, they try.
I know on our side of the house, we've struggled for a couple of years now because it's a relatively remote risk, right? It's just that the magnitude is so extreme. And so we've worked to try to find a way in the insurance market the options that we had to take fundamental reps, even if it was a slightly reduced pricing or rate, was just a little bit unhinged when you were, or maybe not satisfactorily correlated with the actual risk exposure. So I think one of the interesting developments on our side has been finding capacity out there to address just fundamentals and fraud exposure, for that matter, at a highly aggressive rate, where it does make sense to take it up beyond even one of those elevated caps of about 20%, but maybe considering going up to 50% or 75, or even up to purchase price where it's necessary.
We had a client that had to do a deal where it had to agree to cap fundamentals at a single digit. And was a conservative buyer, and they said, fine, how much will rep and warranty insurance cost to insure 100% of my deal value against fundamental breach? And the seller paid for half that, and they shook hands.
I do think it's a sign of how outrageous the market is right now, that people can argue with a straight face that they shouldn't have to indemnify fundamentals, because I mean, how can you say, like, well, I'm not authorized to actually sell you this company, or I don't actually own this company, but they do.
If I represent the seller, though, I'm going to say.
But I've had a fundamental rep breach on a deal, and it was small, and it was simply, they didn't track somebody's stock option, so one stock option was not on the ledger, but still, that's money, and it should not be out of our pocket as buyer.
Agreed. So with that, I think I'd open it up to the floor to the extent that anybody has any questions.
Well, I have a question, Larry. Does this insurance thing really pay?
Yes, it does. I mean,
really?
Yeah. I mean, well, you've got as much experience as I do on it.
Yeah. No,
No, I mean, we certainly have been across a variety of different insurers, worked through and had, varied experience where at some points we've really had to work through, because it is still a negotiation. And I think that the insurers will still do as dutiful a job as a seller would. I mean, where
You mean they'll kick and scream like my sellers when we have indemnification claims against us?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're not expecting that, you're probably in the wrong line of work.
Right.
But at the same time, we have had great recent experience in the 7-8 figure range where the claims have been paid out on a financial statements breach right at around the level that the claim was for. So
with a multiple
with a multiple on it. So it's it does pay, and the examples. I think what's happened is, with the prevalence of the insurance over the last few years, we're now starting to see more and more waves of claims come in, as we've had more policies in force for longer. And so the claims experience is growing. And while not reported as much, I think, as many people would like to see, just because a lot of claims are subject to confidentiality, the experience is growing more robust and more positive.
I had one question. How many of you have seen leak clauses in your agreements where there's fines if the seller or the buyer leaks the transaction?
I've not had that in any transaction.
I haven't either.
Because they're really damaging as far as the whole process and trust and things like that.
I completely agree, and a lot of our transactions unfortunately get leaked, but there's just so many parties involved and so many different advisors. One, it's not surprising, and two, frankly, I think sometimes parties plant them.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, usually only regarding specific diligence items that are being shared.
We do spend a lot of time negotiating NDAs, which I find to be sort of a waste of time since nobody ever enforces them.
Well, I mean, I know on the insurance side as well. We'll obviously run through those NDAs, and then we subsequently have to get all the other parties with whom we're having conversations execute the NDAs as well. So I do think from a documentation perspective, it's very well covered, and I think from an experience perspective, I think important to be dealing with folks that have the same commitment to confidentiality.
That's right.
I'm going to jump in if I could. Can you give us a sense, when do you see post-close claims? Do you see them in 3 months, 6 months, or is it the day before the expiration at whatever it happens to be, 18 months? What's the experience?
We've seen it all, but I would say one inflection point is when you're doing the purchase price adjustment. Buyers getting to drive the car off the lot, taking it home, kicking the tires at home, and that's where we see a lot of claims made is during that process. It might not be a purchase price adjustment, but it might be something else that they discover in that process. I'd say integration is really important, particularly for strategics, because the fact that you have a deal team that knows you have indemnities that expire in a certain amount of time for certain promises. I have seen situations where folks completely blew that. Like, oh, we had an escrow for this? And it just was people not talking in-house about issues that they were having with this new target. So the next, the next inflection point, I'd say after that, usually in the first year.
And follow-up question, if I could, what about when there is a claim? Is that a 12, 18-month scenario, or is it tighter?
I would say the experience varies, but typically it's not a quick process because it involves questions. If they were questions enough that no one figured it out in the deal diligence, usually it's going to require an EY or someone to do a financial analysis if it's a financial or tax loss, or some other investigation. Then you have to convince the seller or the insurer or both that they owe you money. Or if I represent the seller, you have to make a really lock-solid case that you get our money. But, I mean, what are you guys seeing? It's not quick.
Yeah, I think, indemnity claims will often come up when you're doing the first audit during your ownership, or frankly, it's just something random that comes up out of the blue and bites you. I think typically when you're sending a claim letter, it's not straightforward. You're not sending a letter saying, dear so-and-so, this happened, you owe me $100. It's usually, dear so-and-so, this happened, I don't really know how much it will be, but I'm putting you on notice that I have a claim and we'll figure it out as it goes along. That's true for tax claims, litigation that comes up, environmental issues, whatever it is. It's more putting a stake in the ground and saying you owe me money as opposed to making a specific claim until you work it out. Yeah.
How long are they, sorry? How long are they good for? So if you're looking at it from a buyer, it'll differ from a buy side or sell side policy, but if you're looking at it from a buy side policy, a couple of the advantages is obviously you can determine how much insurance you want to buy, but you'll also extend the survival out. So even if you were looking at a no seller recourse where there was no survival, customarily general reps would be taken out in North America out to about 3 years. And tax and fundamental reps will survive 6 years post-closing?
Yeah, we get tax at 6 or more.
Yeah.
Which is really advantageous because in a normal deal that I do, if you have actual indemnification, the survival is never 3 years anymore.
Yeah, I'll say from a strategic perspective also, I mean, we know really quickly if there's a problem just because of the integration process, right? That we get the company as we're integrating it, we're seeing all the warts, right? So we find out really quickly and certainly know within the 3-year period if there's a claim to be made.
I had a tax claim come in at 4 years the other day. It was a company that we sold after 3. We bought reps insurance, sold it 3 years later, and then the new buyer had a tax claim that related back to our purchase. So 4 years later, we were making a claim on our policy.
Wow.
Yeah, can happen.
Yeah. I think common expectations were that most claims would come in within that first audit cycle. But again, even with the limited reporting, AIG puts out a claim study, and I think they had reported where there was a significant number of claims that would come in after the 12-month period. So it's been interesting. I think it's evolving.
How about another, this is a little out of sequence, but timing question. Dana, you intrigued me when we talk about it being a faster, easier negotiation. Are you talking cutting a week off of the time or a day? How meaningful and material does it tend to be if you can use reps and warrants as opposed to arguing it all out?
Yeah, I don't think I can quantify it that way. It's more along the lines of you got the list of stuff you got to deal with, and it's just one less thing you have to deal with, right? So every negotiation's different, every deal is different. And candidly, within a strategic, it's not just how fast can I negotiate the purchase agreement, right? There's a lot of other people doing a lot of other things that have to happen before we can write our check and, sign the deal and, everything's good, right? So it doesn't, yes, it can certainly shorten things, but in a lot of situations, the contract isn't necessarily the thing that's slowing things up. The contract is marching to the beat of the internal drummer.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think the timing of a transaction is really set by the negotiation of the contract itself, because the negotiation really starts well before that as you go through your diligence, pre-legal group diligence. You're finding things that you have to talk out. You have to set up the structure of the transaction and how your purchase price will be set up. There's a lot determined before you get to the contract, and frankly, the contract can go as quickly or as slowly as people want it to go.
I'll say diligence is probably the thing, and that's a lot. Some of our strategic clients tend to do better diligence than even financial buyers, because they're usually in that sector. They have people who are working there all day long, may have even worked with the target or its products. And some of those strategics, though, they overkill the diligence. And I did have one strategic who came to us with saying how much to diligence this international deal. And it was like $2.5 million. It was an incredible amount of diligence. Wouldn't have made the seller happy. And they said, whoa, okay, how much diligence do we need to do if we just want to get insurance against some of these very remote risks that they were going to send people to foreign countries to look at? And it turned out to be a lot cheaper. So that's what they did. But diligence, I think, is often the slowdown, not really the...
Yeah. When I was at Kirkland, one of my major clients was a large strategic, and they would have to get 30 people into a room, one from each department, and all seek alignment. That was kind of their buzzword, and you had to align on whatever it was, and every department had to sign off, which I'm sure drives Dena crazy all day long. So, that's a really different experience from, my private equity fund clients who have a deal team of 3 people and who can make decisions very quickly. They do have to rely on industry experts, and we have to use, an insurance expert and a accounting expert and a tax expert and whatever, but those people come in, they kind of do the down and dirty and give us a higher overview of the world. I think at times strategics can pay more, but we usually can move faster and perhaps be more accommodating on things like deal terms.
A lot of these times these sellers are trying to operate a fast-growing company at the same time they're trying to meet your diligence requests. And again, some strategics just forget that, and it ends up really, they say, gosh, the target's not responsive at all. Well, it's because the people that you're making these requests to are also running a business that is growing so fast you're paying 20 times EBITDA. So pick your battles.
Yeah.
Okay, we have just run over a minute, but I think it was a good minute. And before we adjourn, though, real quickly, James, you don't realize you just set me up for a great plug here. First of all, what I'd like to ask is if you would fill out the survey. And the segue is the survey asks what topics and issues we should be addressing at these programs in the future. At our next M&A conference, if you look ahead at the agenda, there's a session on the use of leaks. Intentional, when to leak, how to manage that effectively, intentionally. Then we have a counterpoint part of that. What happens when there are leaks, unintentional or from the other party? And so if you're enjoying these discussions, that's a topic that we think we want to address and understand better, the practice and method around leaks. So as you fill out the survey, tell me what you think. Good idea? Bad idea? Should we cover leaks? Should we go deeper into some other areas that maybe came up today? So if you'll take a minute during the next break and fill out the survey, what are the topics? What are the issues? I'd be grateful for the feedback. But before we adjourn, let's please give this great panel a round of applause.
Thank you.